Okay, so Aquinas on natural law. This is question 94 of the first part of the second part. Just some sort of general comments about Aquinas on law, on natural law in particular. So natural law, Aquinas says in question 91, Article 2, natural law, which he's discussing, again, we're reading question 94, but earlier in question 91, Article 2, Aquinas says natural law is the specifically or distinctly human way of participating in eternal law. The eternal law, Aquinas says, is basically that law by which God rules the universe, and Aquinas says natural law is the sort of distinctly or uniquely human way of participating in that law. So natural law is known to people through reason, also through conscience, which Aquinas defines as the application of knowledge to a particular act. So again, conscience, he says, is very much about knowledge, about reason. And so again, you know, when Aquinas talks about natural law, he's not just talking about a feeling or a sense that we have that something is right or wrong. It's very much something that we know by reason. Conscience, which again is something of a feeling, is obviously not simply a proposition, but Aquinas would say something that we do sense or that we do feel, but he says ultimately conscience is a matter of applying knowledge to a particular act. Was that act right or wrong? Was my decision not to act right or wrong? Aquinas says again that it's not just an irrational feeling that we have, but the application of knowledge to a particular action. So it's through reason, through conscience, that we know the natural law, and the basic idea of natural law is not just for Aquinas, but usually when people use the term natural law, what they mean is a law that's rooted in human nature. Obviously, sometimes when people talk about natural law, the laws of nature, they're talking about physics or chemistry or something. In the context of ethics or politics, the idea of a natural law is a law of morality that is rooted in human nature and therefore is universal. It's true for everyone, it's binding on everyone, it's, again, rooted in human nature and therefore it's universal, and it's therefore binding on everyone. Everyone is obliged to recognize and to follow the natural law. Obviously, people have argued that there is no such thing, but that's what natural law means, something that's universal, that's known to everyone, that applies to or that binds everyone. Therefore, Aquinas will say in question 96, Article 4, the question of whether or not human laws bind people in conscience, whether or not human beings are bound by their conscience to obey human laws. And Aquinas says just human laws, yes, human laws that are just, people are obliged, their conscience obliges them to obey those laws or to follow them, but he says unjust laws, human laws that are unjust, people are not bound by conscience to follow. And he says, in fact, some of them, if they're unjust in certain ways, people are actually bound to resist them, to disobey that law. So this, of course, is a very important idea in many ways. The idea of resisting particular human laws because they're unjust basically relies on the idea of something like natural law, a standard of right and wrong that transcends or that is independent of any particular individual set of laws or law code or anything like that. The idea, again, of something independent of any particular set of human laws, which can therefore be used to judge those laws. Are these laws just? Are the laws of this society just or unjust, right or wrong? You have an independent standard in natural law that enables you to make that judgment. And not everybody thinks that there is such a standard, but that's the idea of natural law. And so basically, so it's very important, again, for the idea of resisting unjust laws, changing society, saying that the fact that something prevails in a particular place as a law doesn't mean that it's automatically right or just or deserving of any particular respect or obedience. And Aquinas himself says all of that, and so basically that's what natural law is. Again, he says it's known through reason, very important, and the essence of all law, Aquinas discusses law in general in question 90. The essence of law, the basic characteristics of law, it's an act of reason. Law comes from reason. Again, it's not irrational in some way. It's for the common good. So Aquinas says, every law, if it's actually a law, needs to be directed to the common good, the good of the community as a whole. Remember, Thrasymachus said justice is simply the advantage of the stronger. All laws are created simply to benefit the stronger who are making the laws. Aquinas says that's not true. Not all laws are that way, and the ones that are unjust. Genuine laws look to the common good, and he actually says laws that don't are really more violence than actual law. They're really more acts of violence because, again, they are coercion for private good rather than the actual law. So he says, Aquinas says all laws have to be an act of reason, they have to be directed to the common good, and they have to be promulgated. If there's a law and no one actually knows that it exists, it's obviously not much of a law, so it has to be promulgated or made known to people. And again, Aquinas says natural law made known to people through reason, through conscience. It's part of our very nature. That's how we come to know about it. And so basically the discussion here in question 94, to come to the particulars, Article 1, we won't really look at whether the natural law is a habit. Again, a somewhat technical question. medieval philosophy. We don't need to worry about that for this class. The important point, he says, the natural law is something appointed by reason, just as a proposition is a work of reason. So again, the natural law, something that comes from reason, something which we're informed about by reason. The second article, whether the natural law contains several precepts or only one. And this may seem like a very kind of abstract, fairly remote question, whether there are several precepts to the natural law or just one. But in answering it, Aquinas really kind of lays out what he means by natural law in a very detailed and comprehensive way. So the first thing to look at here, Article 2, we'll start with the sed contra. And interestingly, Aquinas actually does not cite an authority here. Usually in the sed contra, the part that begins on the contrary, Aquinas usually cites an authority, sometimes the Bible, sometimes a theologian, occasionally just a philosopher, but here he cites no authority at all. And he basically says, as he puts it, the precepts of the natural law on man stand in relation to practical matters as the first principles to matters of demonstration. But there are several first indemonstrable principles. Therefore, there are also several precepts of natural law. So basically, he says, and here he sets up, again, and this is what much of the first part of the answer deals with, this idea that Aquinas has that our reason or our minds really tell us the way that the world is. Our reasons or our mind give us access to reality. So the speculative reason, the practical reason, he sets up a parallel here. He says, since there are several first indemonstrable principles for a speculative reason that deals with demonstration, we'll talk about what that means in a minute. He says there are also several precepts of the natural law. So basically, you might say, well, why exactly would it be the same? But the key point here is, he says again, natural law just comes from the reason, comes specifically from the practical reason, and he sets up this analogy between practical and speculative reason. So speculative reason is reason, and he goes on and explains this in the responsio. Speculative reason would be reason that deals with things that we can only speculate about. So a classic question, is the universe eternal or created? We speculate about that. We have to use reason to figure out. No one knows from experience. No one knows. It's not self-evident. So we have to reason, and we have to use speculative reason. It's something that, again, we can't reason about from experience. We're trying to understand this truth about the universe. So we use reason. That speculative reason is something we speculate about. It's something that we can only sort of try to figure out using reason, but not based on any kind of direct experience of the answer that we have. Practical reason, by contrast, deals with, as it suggests, practical matters. So, your friend comes to the door and wants his gun back, wants his weapon back. He seems crazy. Is it just to give him back the weapon? There you reason, and Aquinas, you don't just say, well, how do I feel about this? Do I feel like it's right? You think, well, what is this right or wrong? What is normally the right thing to do? Would this be an exception? Is it a justified exception? If so, why? So Aquinas says, these are questions for practical reason. They're practical matters. It's not something like, is the universe eternal or created? But it's something that we use reason for to figure out, how should I act? What is the right thing to do in this case? And again, just like in the case of speculative reason, if you say, is the universe eternal or created? No one would say, well, how do I feel about it being eternal? I think I feel good about that, so I'll say, yeah, it's eternal. No, you would use reason to try, what are the arguments on each side? Which arguments are more convincing? Can one side be refuted? Can the other one demonstrate its conclusion definitively? And again, Aquinas says it's the same thing with practical matters, with actual action, with moral, ethical action. We use reason. Again, we don't just say, well, how do I feel? I don't know. We actually use reason to try to figure out what is the right thing to do. So he says, and he says again that we have this speculative reason, we also have practical reason. And again, he says both of these things basically tell us the way that the world is. What seems self-evident to practical reason, what seems self-evident to speculative reason is indeed self-evident. The way that it reasons based on those first self-evident principles takes it to the truth. And in the same way with practical reason, we'll see, he says, practical reason is a little bit less sure or a little bit less precise than speculative reason, but he says it's the same thing. The basic first principle of self-evident principle of practical reason, that the good is to be done, the evil avoided. Aquinas says that's based on our nature, and that's true, and again, that's sort of self-evident to us, and we don't really need to try to question that or establish why would it be, or to be skeptical about that or anything like that. So basically, and then we come to these as he goes on to explain some of what this means. He talks about self-evident again, and what's self-evident in itself, and what's self-evident only to some people. And he says, we can kind of move over that. But he basically says, now a certain order is to be found in those things that are apprehended universally. So again, he's saying natural law just like the speculative reason, practical reason, just like speculative reason, rests on certain things that are apprehended or understood universally, understood by all people. So he says, for that which before aught else falls under apprehension is being, the notion of which is included in all things whatsoever a man apprehends. So he says, what is apprehended or perceived before anything else is being. Whatever we understand of something, before we understand anything at all, we see that it actually exists. However we might analyze something, however we might make sense of it, think about it, debate what it is, and so on, the first thing that we apprehend is the fact that it actually exists, that it is a being, that it's something that's right there that exists. So Aquinas says the first thing that the speculative reason apprehends is being. And again, this is spelled out here in this table, which is available on Blackboard. The practical reason, the first thing that apprehends is the good. When we want to do something, when we feel some sort of an impulse or a desire to do something, whatever it is, the first thing that we apprehend is the good. That's why we're drawn towards it. As he says again and again, following Aristotle, the people act for ends. The good is an end. The end for which people act is some kind of a good. Therefore, when you make a decision, even before you make a decision, just when you sort of feel drawn to something, the first thing that you apprehend there is the good. The practical reason, the first thing that it sees is that something is good. The practical reason, before it figures out anything in specific, it sort of apprehends that something is good and that it should figure out what the good is and pursue that. So the first principle then that he says, each type of reason has its own first principle. Since speculative reason first apprehends being, existence, the first principle, which it sort of is self-evident but is based on this first apprehension of being or existence, its first principle is the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time. So again, someone cannot be alive and not alive at the same time. It cannot be Monday and not Monday at the same time. Something cannot be white and not white at the same time. Again, as we've talked about before, it can be white and black, a black and white cookie, but the part of it that's white cannot be white and not white at the same time. The part of it that's black is not white. So it's not white and not white at the same time. So, basically, principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot exist and not exist at the same time. Something cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time. That's the same basic idea, just referring to the person who's doing the affirming or the denying, the rational or the inquiring person who looks at something and can't affirm and deny something at the same time, because more fundamentally, something cannot be and not be at the same time. So Aquinas says that's the first principle, the first self-evident principle. No one says, well, I don't know, maybe someone can be alive and not alive at the same time. I mean, there are figurative ways you can say, well, maybe they're not really alive, maybe they're not really living their life, but physically they're alive. Well, someone cannot be physically alive and not physically alive at the same time. Aquinas says that's just self-evident. And then on the basis of that, you can build other other things that are self-evident once you think about it. So as he puts it, he says something like, things equal to one and the same are equal to one another. So in other words, if A equals B and C equals B, then A equals C. So if A and C are both equal to B, then A and C are also equal to each other. Aquinas says that's self-evident because, again, you can't affirm and deny the same thing at the same time. You can't say that A and C are both equal to B and yet somehow not equal to B so that they're not equal to each other. No, it's self-evident. As he puts it, things equal to one and the same are equal to one another. So again, if A and C are both equal to B, then A and C are also equal to each other. Aquinas says you can build further things on this first principle, but the first principle itself, that something cannot be and not be at the same time, cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time, Aquinas says this is self-evident. This is the first self-evident principle of speculative reason. And the same way, he says, with practical reason, he says the first principle is the good is to be done and pursued, and the evil is to be avoided. And again, he says this is self-evident. If you ask someone, well, why should we do good? Why don't we do the evil instead? Why don't we do what's bad rather than what's good? It's not really, Aquinas says, well, it's just kind of self-evident that, again, that we're oriented towards the good. If you're hungry and there's food, and obviously it would be good for you to eat because you're very hungry, you would never think, well, maybe I shouldn't eat. Maybe I should just be hungry and see what happens. Or it's actually better if I'm hungry and not actually doing what I need to survive, or just not to be hungry. That it's just self-evident that we seek the good and avoid the evil. So Aquinas says that's the first principle of speculative reason. Everything else flows from that. And then he goes on and he basically says that, as he says in the following paragraph, the third paragraph of the Responsio, since, however, good has the nature of an end, and evil the nature of a contrary, hence it is that all those things to which a man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reason as being good. and consequently as objects of pursuit, and their contraries as evil and objects of avoidance. So again, he says this is sort of basically just self-evident, and people pursue the good, avoid the evil, and reason kind of naturally apprehends that, and therefore starts to think, okay, what's the best way to pursue this particular good? What's the best way to avoid this evil? How do I balance different goods, and so on? These are things that Aquinas says are just kind of built into nature, built into nature, and therefore also built into reason, so that reason just kind of does this on its own. And then he goes on, he says that basically, wherefore, according to the order of natural inclinations, is the order of the precepts of the natural law. So basically what he's saying here is that the order of natural inclinations, as he goes on to explain, human beings, as Aquinas would say, are composite creatures, or compound creatures. We have different natures. We have the physical nature that we share with all physical things, all substances, as he says here. We have an animal nature that we share with all animals, and then we have a distinctly human nature, which is defined above all by reason. So Aquinas says there, as he puts it, different natural goods and different order of order of precepts. Again, natural order, an order of natural inclinations, an order of precepts of the natural law. And again, this is also spelled out in this table. So the first is the good in accordance with the nature which man, human beings, has in common with all substances. So all substances, even rocks, this is Aquinas' explanation for certain physical characteristics, that heavy things want to be at rest so that they can preserve their nature. He would say this is why plants seek the sunlight, to preserve themselves, and obviously animals as well. And he says, human beings have this in common with all substances, self-preservation. It's a basic good for human beings, and he says reason recognizes this as a good. Reason recognizes that self-preservation is a good for human beings, and again, it's a natural good, and it's something we have in common with all substances. And then he says the next type of natural good is the good in accordance with the nature we have in common with other animals. And he says sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so forth. I think animals don't spend that much time educating their offspring. You don't really see little schoolhouses with rabbits in them and so on, but they teach them how to hunt, how to avoid hunters. There's at least some element of educating their offspring. And obviously sexual intercourse, reproduction. Aquinas says this is a good we have in accordance with the nature that we share with other animals. So like all animals, we want to reproduce. We want to continue our species, and therefore sexual intercourse seems to us as a good for the sake of reproduction. But again, we'll see that there's, for human beings, there's this sort of unique, the way that human beings pursue all of these things is ideally rationally. So it's somewhat different for people because we're human beings, because we have reason, but Aquinas says it's still the basic good that we share with animals: sexual intercourse, education of offspring, other things he doesn't specify, but again, reproduction, educating the offspring, and so on. Then finally, there's the good in accordance to the nature of his reason, which is proper to human beings. So then there's finally the good in accordance with this distinctively human property or a nature of reason. This is the nature that's proper to human beings. And Aquinas says the truth here is to know the truth, or the imperative here, the imperative of natural law here is to know the truth about God, to live in society, and therefore other things that follow from this, other things that help to support this. So he says, in this respect, whatever pertains to this inclination belongs to natural law. For instance, to shun ignorance, to avoid offending those among whom one has to live, and other such things regarding the above inclinations. Again, there are other things, he can't spell out all of them, but he says, to know the truth about God is part of the good that is specifically human, is good for us because of the specific nature we have as rational creatures. And he says, therefore, shunning ignorance is also part of the natural law. Not just knowing the truth specifically about God, but avoiding or trying to overcome ignorance all over the place, always trying to shun ignorance, because Aquinas will say, all knowledge will take you to God. All knowledge will help you understand God better by helping you understand the world, and so on. So he says, to know the truth about God, and therefore it follows from that to shun ignorance. To live in society as rational creatures, there are certain needs that we have, certain virtues that we want to realize, cultivate, practice. That we can only do those things in society. So Aquinas says, our nature, it's good for us to live in society, and therefore things that help to promote that, like avoiding offending those among whom you have to live. It's a little vague what exactly that means. surely, I mean, as we find out later, he doesn't mean obeying unjust laws just because everyone around you is, but, in one way or another, don't avoid people needlessly among whom you have to live, because that would be bad for society. But he says there's this final, there's this final natural good for human beings, which is particular to their nature as rational creatures. And again, it means above all to know the truth about God, also to live in society, and then the things that follow from that, like shunning ignorance. Okay, so he says, that's the order of goods for human beings, and that's the sort of different precepts of natural law based on the different natural goods that human beings have as part of our nature. Now, obviously, again, as I talked about a little bit earlier, human beings, he says we have some of these goods in common with all substances, in particular animals, but of course, animals tend to preserve these things instinctively. Self-preservation. Animals don't sit around and think about is it right, is it wrong? And if a wolf eats a rabbit to stay alive, the wolf doesn't think, well, was that right? Should I have done that? Was that the right thing to do? Should I have tried to be a vegetarian or something? Should I try to get some tofu or something? The wolf just operates on instinct and eats the rabbit and doesn't think about it. The same with sexual intercourse among animals. They're basically just going on instinct, and they don't really think about it. There's no real deliberation. There's no real rationality or responsibility involved. It's just a matter of instinct. Human beings are obviously different. So if I killed someone and took their money and said, well, this will be useful for my self-preservation, Aquinas would say that you were not acting according to the natural law when you did that. Murder is wrong according to the natural law. You can't just do whatever you want and then justify it in terms of self-preservation. In the same way, sexual intercourse. Human beings it's not simply a matter of instinct for human beings. Human beings always deliberate. There's always some rational thought going into decisions to have sex. Maybe not always as much rational thought as would be ideal, but that's the whole point. That's where Aquinas would say that's how it becomes bad or even evil, is when you stop listening to reason and you pursue a good in a way that is sort of divorced from reason, ignoring reason, and therefore you pursue the good, the pleasure of sexual intercourse, or simply of eating, for instance, which obviously is pleasant because it helps your body senses food is good. So the more that you eat, it's pleasant. If you simply pursue that pleasure, divorced from any kind of rational consideration of, is this really good for me? Am I becoming too for lack of a better word, too addicted to attached to the pleasures of eating? And is that sort of hampering my studies, my attempts to know God? Is it making me selfish and a bad citizen and harming society in a certain way? The same with sexual intercourse. Again, Aquinas says it is naturally good, but if you stop listening to reason and pursue it in a completely irrational way, then that's when it becomes bad, even evil. That's when, again, it can be harmful for you. It can stop you from pursuing these higher precepts of the natural law, seeking the truth about God, and so on. And again, it can also harm other people. So Aquinas would say, these things are human goods, but as human goods, because they're human goods, and because human beings are rational creatures, these goods can only be, or should only be, pursued according to reason. So a lot of what tells us, well, what is the right thing, what is the wrong thing? Again, Aquinas says, well, reason comes in and tells you when something is excessive, when it's not, when something is being done properly, when it's being done in a way that's wrong or improper. And again, he says, so all of this comes from natural law. We can look briefly at the objections. Objection 1 says the law is a kind of precept. If therefore there were many precepts of the natural law, it would follow that there are also many natural laws. Aquinas says these different precepts of natural law have the character of one natural law inasmuch as they flow from one first precept. So the objector basically says, because again, officially, technically, the question is whether the natural law contains several precepts or only one. The objector is saying that if it the objector is saying that the natural law contains only one precept, because if there were many, there would be also many different natural laws. Aquinas says there are different precepts, but they all flow from this one first precept. Objection 2 basically says either natural law has only one precept, since human nature is a unity, or it has several precepts because there are several parts to human nature. But if the latter is the case, if it has several precepts because there are different parts of human nature, as we see Aquinas says in the Responsio, In that case, every part of human nature is related to natural law, even things like, as the objector puts it, the inclination of the concupiscible faculty. So again, even the desire for physical pleasure would be related to the natural law, and yet the objector seems to say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with natural law. The desire for physical pleasure, that's not part of the natural law. Aquinas replies and says, yes, it is all parts of human nature, even the concupiscible and irascible parts belong to the natural law insofar as they are ruled by reason. So even the desire for pleasure, even anger, all of these things are belong to the natural law, are governed by the natural law insofar as they're ruled by reason. So again, natural law comes back very much to reason for Aquinas. So that's pretty much, hopefully clarifies what all he's saying about the natural law in the second article, which again is officially about whether the natural law contains several precepts or one only. But in the course of explaining that, he sets up this, explains the parallel between speculative and practical reason, and how what that tells us about the natural law, how we come to know the natural law through the practical reason as a result, and also, of course, then what it means to have several precepts given that human nature is composite. So there's a lot going on in this one article.